Welcome back to Your Story Medicine. I am your host, Jumoke, or June for short. And just a reminder, Jumoke is a combination of my first, middle, last name. But today I am with Gabes Torres, who has been active in the work of anti-racism and decolonization, particularly in the fields of mental health, education, spirituality, music, and community organizing. She is a racial and migration trauma-informed psychotherapist and intends to decolonize the therapeutic space. She also offers clinical support and care at recovery centers that shelter and support survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence. Welcome, Gabes.
Yay, thank you, Jim McKay.
Yay.
Thanks for having me.
And I at the time of this recording, recently you hosted a beautiful virtual gathering ceremony. I think it was a fundraiser for the Philippines. And yeah, I
We
saw how
did.
you weaved in other folks of the Filipinx diaspora. I saw Uma Witt, who was on there as well, who actually was one of my former clients who
Oh, that's dope.
the vision was to reclaim Filipino songs for the
Mm.
diaspora. And it just brings me so much joy to see more of you stepping into these roles of like making your ancestors proud. So I'm excited to dig into today's conversation. But the first question I always love to ask is, what are you celebrating about yourself?
Hmm, what a beautiful question. In this moment, I would say that this feels like a time where I'm intentionally stepping into my power and felt like this was a very clear nudge from my team of ancestors and spirit guides and angels, which we'll probably like delve into a little bit further later. In terms of how that looks like, I am yet to discover, but I'm really proud of myself and really celebrate just how I am saying yes to that, saying yes to this new journey. Since most of my life there has been a lot of fear of my own power and fear of how um, people, particularly, white cis male or cis men, would respond to that. But knowing at this point that I say yes with the awareness and with the confidence that I am guided, that I am divinely supported, and also protected, whether that may be from that team or my team of kindred spirits or kindred friends right now. Um, and leading with more of that confidence and more of that awareness than with fear.
Yes. Yeah. Um, Something that I was told is that the body doesn't know the difference between what is fear and what is excitement. It
Mm-hmm.
just comes down to the stories that we tell ourselves about
Uh-huh.
our experience.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about where is it that you currently call home? And in your own words, if you could describe your medicine outside of just calling yourself a therapist, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm. Home is a very complex thing for me as somebody who is a migrant and who continues to journey and see what belonging looks like. But geographically, I am currently based in so called Seattle, Washington. Um, it is the ancestral and stolen land of the Duwamish community. So I just wanted to ask permission from them that I may do good work with you today through this podcast. In terms of medicine, this is going to sound a little unoriginal at the outset because the name of your podcast is Story Medicine, but stories are definitely my medicine, whether that may be listening to stories or sharing stories. And um, I believe that storytelling and story listening are a foundational and core component to who we are as human beings, as social creatures, as members of the ecosystem. And I believe that stories are so powerful that it can do so much good and healing, and it can also do harm. As someone who I would consider myself a postcolonial scholar. I did a significant amount of study of postcolonialism for my master's, um, specifically Philippine colonization, or the colonization that took place in the Philippines for centuries. I discovered that there is a way in which storytelling can be distorted, and that lies are told about certain stories. For instance, for the longest time, I believed that, through oral tradition and even through history textbooks, I've bought into the story that it was the white Americans who, quote unquote, saved us from Spanish colonization, and that resulted into us, believing that whiteness is supreme. You see that in the booming business that is skin lightening products as a result, because of how much we have esteemed, whiteness, Western culture, even in schools where to talk in English, straight English without the Filipino accent is considered sophisticated and educated, and to speak in one's own native tongue is not. So these are ways in which, stories can be used for harm, and even for our own self-rejection and, sense of self-inferiority, which is called colonized mentality. And I borrow that from, Dr. Seleni Mendoza Strobel and EJR David. And I believe that the medicinal healing qualities of story and storytelling is when you tell the truth. And whether that may be one's own personal truth, or the truth about what had happened to your people, what continues to happen to your people and to you, that I believe brings a lot of liberation and a lot of healing. And I also want to say that for those of us who are in some form of like healthcare or even mental health, like the healing process is far more painful than of the event of the injury, right? Like the truth can sting. I know for myself, like when I was reading and learning a lot more about pre-colonial Philippines and about our story of colonialism, it brought a lot of pain in my body. It somehow remembered, a lot of the pain of my ancestors. And so, just wanting to say that it is not a romanticized process either, in bearing witness to truth in stories. But it is worthy, like the healing is worth it. I can say that for me, that when I paid attention to the artists, to the scholars who told the truth about who we are, um, as Filipinos, or Filipinx or Filipinas, um, brought a lot of healing for me, and, felt validated, and felt like there's a sense of belonging, a restored sense of belonging there. So that's my medicine.
Hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. The immediate image I had in my mind as you were speaking was of one of the first zoos in the United States that we don't really talk as publicly about. This is the stuff that I had to learn after school, how there were Filipinos who were literally placed in zoos in New York and were seen as a spectacle. And it's like, whoa, that was just short of 100 years ago
Mm-hmm.
where that was happening.
Yeah, yeah. It's not an old and new story. It's yeah.
But to also see how you are showing up in the ways that you do to be able to humanize the experience of immigrants, and to also know that we don't have to be defined by what has happened historically. We don't have to be defined by our traumas, that we can tell ourselves a new story without dismissing what has happened
Mm-hmm.
in the past. That takes a lot of healing, because I feel like it's so easy for us to just identify with our traumas and not know that there can be another way. But also, how do we go through that without ignoring the pain or
Yeah.
bypassing it altogether?
Mm-hmm.
So share with us more about your ancestors, your ancestral lineage, and how do you feel that has influenced your medicine today?
So I am a descendant of Mirza Bong Betia Torres and Gerardo Torres. I always find it important to name them out loud. I come from a lineage of educators. I am third generation teacher, and I also come from a lineage of whom I would consider revolutionaries. My Lola, my grandma, is a guerrilla warrior during World War II. She was actually a guerrilla spy for the Philippines against Japanese occupation, which was one of the most brutal forms of oppression that the Filipinos had experienced. And I also am a descendant of the Aita indigenous tribes of the Philippines, who are a very nomadic tribe, which is very reflective of my own nomadic sense of being. I always have itchy feet. I already have itchy feet, especially during a pandemic. So I pay homage to them and their resilience and um, their own expansive generative capacity to teach and to tell stories about who we are and how much we as a community are worth not just, yes, worth fighting for and also worth preserving and also celebrating. And that we don't need the approval of any white person to be able to know and verify that we are worthy.
Yeah, I think that many of us have had struggles growing up with colorism in our own communities. Whenever I would go back to Thailand, all of my cousins and my aunties would bleach their skin. And I never understood because in the United States, people wanted to be tan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, where do these standards even come from?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think that when we can embody what it looks like to feel good in these bodies, that within itself to me is revolutionary. You mentioned like, okay, one of the things that I am feeling challenged with is this narrative of struggle and fight and then rest and surrender. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I get that white supremacy exists. It's a real thing. Racism, sexism, oppression is a real
Capitalism.
thing. Capitalism, but where do you find the balance between fight and rest and pleasure as a revolutionary act?
Mm-hmm. It continues to be a question day to day because immigrant and migrant culture and just the story is that for you to survive, you have to hustle all the time. So I want to be able to name that identity piece of being both a woman of color and also being a migrant herself, that to it feels risky. It feels so risky to take a moment, to take a pause, to take a breath. Um, and and that's okay. I think that the journey of releasing perfection or the sense of needing to be perfect also doesn't have to be perfect. So for me to not have like a solidified answer to that, I'm trying to be, and I'm trying so hard to be hospitable to myself in not having to have it all together. I believe that it is important to always check in with myself, consenting with myself, um, making the active or mindful decision or choice to ask myself, okay, Gabes, have we eaten? Do we need a nap today? And that is revolutionary because the story that was told in colonialism is that you're only a commodity, that you are a product or a resource to be used and shaped by the colonizer. And when you choose to humanize yourself, which is by way of taking a breath, asking yourself what you need, asking yourself what you want, asking what flavors or what textures that you want to relish and enjoy in, that is being anti-oppressive because you are serving yourself, because you are attending to yourself and to your own needs that, than of somebody else's. So yeah, consenting and checking in with self, and also understanding that you don't always have to have it all together, even in the process of restoration and recreation and taking a breath.
Yeah, I know that there are a lot of people listening who may have gone through higher education, like yourself, who are licensed therapists and who feel this fear of being able to include language like decolonization in their practice. And also, we're to really talk about what does it look like to decolonize or indigenize our healing work, then wouldn't we essentially like dismantle the the mental health wellness industrial complex altogether to really make it more accessible for everybody to receive healing without being like, okay, you're broken, you need healing, but like we can normalize that a lot of the challenges we may think we're experiencing in isolation or what we may call depression or anxiety are actually systemic. Um, so I'm curious on your take on that. And I also want to acknowledge that being able to use terms like indigenize or decolonize, we first um, have to acknowledge that that is a phrase that derives from First Nation people. So I just want to hear your take on how is it that you're navigating the mental health world from this decolonial framework?
Right. Yeah, it's really tough considering that the mental health world is not exempt from having foundations and structures of white supremacy and oppression. And I could go on and on with the stories and the cases in which that has, that's always been the case. There's an over pathologizing of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color. There, to the extent that for BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, where BIPOC choose to resist oppression, that is considered like a mental disorder. In fact, that was a mental disorder historically coined by a white man psychiatrist. I can't remember the exact date, but that's like the very foundation that hasn't been dismantled. So you're right there. In navigating these spaces, I would say I would lean into intersectional feminism or intersectionality, which I pay homage to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is one of the educators and pioneers of critical race theory, who is the researcher behind intersectionality, which is the acknowledgement of how your social identities based on race, gender, sexuality, ability, class, etc., have an impact on how you navigate the world or how you're being perceived by people and by systems in the world. So I think that to decolonize the therapeutic space, there has to be an acknowledgement that the client, the patient, is coming in with these intersecting social identities, that there's something about them being a Black or brown, let's say a trans woman, that impacts treatment. And we've had psychologists before who said that you have to treat every patient equally. You don't look into how their identities play out in treatment or in healing, but in decolonizing this space, you got to politicize it. You got to like say that there's something about their social identity, which is, let's just say, me as a Filipino woman, as a queer Filipino woman, as a queer, I would as a queer Filipino woman, the treatment is different because the struggle is different compared to a white cis man. Sure, we could live in like the same um, city, perhaps even have the same class ranking, but my struggle is going to be different compared to his because of how misogyny, sexism, anti-Filipino or anti-BIPOC racism that exists in this city. And so the call of the mental health practitioner who wants to do decolonizing work is to pay attention to how much the system either how the system hinders them from thriving, from choosing their preferred future, from healing. So I think that there's a need to lean into these stories and these social identities as opposed to just the symptom. I would say in certain teaching and speaking engagements that a westernized, a white approach to mental health looks at the symptom, but a decolonized one looks at the story, like the full story, the story of oppression, the story of even a story of resilience and resistance in one's people. So it's harder work. It might feel lonely because you might be surrounded, and I'm addressing this to mental health practitioners who are listening right now. It might feel it probably already is lonely because you might be the one who keeps addressing anti-racist approaches, who keeps asking the questions during DEI trainings, saying that it's not enough. But I hope that you know that you are not alone, even though in certain moments it does feel like it. But you are doing such incredible, perhaps never before done work to the level like this. And you're healing your clients. You're healing their ancestors. You're part of their healing. You're part of the healing of their ancestors as well, especially your BIPOC clients. So, yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. And
The first thing that came to my mind when you said that was like, or you end up being the one to lead those trainings, and yet how many of your participants are actually going to integrate it in their everyday lives? Why? Because I was that person. Oh,
yeah.
anything about racism, gender, oppression, let's give it to June. I'm like, but y'all need it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, on the note of ancestral and intergenerational healing, tell us about why this is so integral to our growth and collective liberation.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
what does that look like for you? Because I feel like it's so easy for people who are in the role as the healers or the therapists to be the ones holding everybody else's stories,
Yeah.
and who's really present to be there for you. So, how
Mm-hmm.
has that unfolded in your life?
Yeah. Well, the reason why ancestral healing is important is because the the trauma is ancestral. The trauma is intergenerational, and that is something that has been overlooked because of living in an individualistic society where it's pretty common for people to think that when you experience some form of trauma, it's only within your story, but we don't see the interconnectedness of all things. We don't see, or we don't acknowledge, or don't understand, but not all, a lot of folks who have grown up in individualistic cultures believe that my trauma stays and my harm stays within my story, when it's actually genetically, psychobiologically passed down. There are certain research that says up to 14, some say up to 3. But the fact of the matter is that we have inherited ancestral harm and trauma and maybe even shame. And so there needs to be that conversation and that practice of therefore healing. Um, and how that looks like, well, two things. I'm going to just shamelessly plug, unapologetically plug my heritage workshop on ancestral interconnectedness, where I gather, where there are BIPOC only participants. And we engage with ancestral rage and grief and process that together. We do mindfulness embodiment practices. We share stories about our ancestors. We share instances where, you know, people would notice a butterfly during the workshop, and in certain cultures, particularly in mine, we consider that to be a symbol of a passed on loved one who shows up. We talk about the dreams that we also inherited, like nightly dreams, like in your sleep dreams that we have inherited from ancestors. It's just a brave and safe space. I hope safe space for BIPOC to have these conversations and to reclaim stories of their ancestors. So that to me is how I practice it in the context of kin, in the context of BIPOC community, people who get it and who don't have to always question the um, the the validity of these experiences. Because when you bring these conversations to white spaces, they're going to raise their eyebrows. They're going to ask you for a footnote. They're going to ask you for a resource to be able to like back up the experience. I've had these experiences before where I have friends and people like I even dated who are white before, would not celebrate with me in that. So it feels so needed to practice and to metabolize these stories, at least for me, in certain spaces like this. And another way that I practice is every other morning, I would do some ritual and I would bring out, you know, candles and guava leaf incense, because that's what pre-colonial Philippines had used for incense and also for healing. Um, and I would always ask permission from my ancestors and from Mother Earth and from occupied Duwamish territory guardians and ancestors that I may do healing work. There's something about permission and consent that are also underlooked and not as valued anymore in this culture and in this society. So I then rise and say, I know who I am, and I ask permission from the cosmos, from my ancestors, from Mother Earth, from the recent and ancient ancestors of this land, that I may do healing, restorative, and justice-oriented work. I even ask permission that I may play, that I may be nourished, that I may choose to love. I ask permission that I will love and to be loved and to heal, because we're all in this together. You know, it's not, actually, let me rephrase that. There's so many associations around all in this together. Let me just erase that. But we are moving forward towards our liberation and our healing in ways that are collective and also intergenerational. And sure, we could make the argument that it is personal and individual, but it's not if, but how we're connected.
Yeah. So how have you experienced your own healing within your lineage as you've been doing this work?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why this is coming up for me is because I feel like we're constantly speaking in these binaries, black, white, BIPOC versus white, and yet there's a lot of folks of color whose parents, whose families have so much healing to do around their own internalized oppression,
Yeah.
that we even see people in our own communities
Mm-hmm.
embodying white supremacy.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
oftentimes it's the descendants who are doing the healing around that. Like I know for my parents, thankfully that it wasn't as big with them, but there was a point where they were like very anti-LGBTQ until I started bringing them to watch the performances of my friends. And I remember my mom saying, oh my gosh, I really wish that I I didn't vote for that. And I know that her view changed because of the stories, but also because of the healing work that I was doing, while also learning to have compassion for her experience. Whereas in my 20s, when I was the angry young activist, everything was reactionary, and I was upset at my family and my parents for not essentially being politicized. And I had to take a step back and be like, wow, you know what? Because of my parents, I've had this privilege of being able to obtain higher education so that I have language and frameworks to really give a better understanding of my own lived experience being in this body. So what has that been like for you?
Yeah. So in the workshop, I would have a separate email to non-Black and non-Indigenous people of color, participants of color, and tell them that as you step into this workshop, we have to be brave enough to acknowledge and recognize that we are at this intersection of being both marginalized and also privileged. We are at this intersection of having our own stories of oppression, which is valid, it happened, while also having to come face to face with anti-Blackness that is within us, within our community, through in my story, or in my community, model minority myth, and as we said, like internalized oppression and colonized mentality. So it is a very nuanced journey. And I think that there will be more questions. I've come to see that there have been more and more questions than there are answers. But my hope and my intention around this is to be able for myself to do healing work without having to put extra emotional mental labor on Black folks. And to also acknowledge that it is because of Black folks that I have my anti-racist education, that I have my decolonization education, that it is because of their labor, because of their stories, that why I am where I am right now. So wanting to make that clear at the outset. As for the parents and for the family, it's tough because we cannot change them. And it's tough because from their perspective, we are still in some ways their kids, because in some ways we are.
I know. I just like feel like every time I go back to the motherland with my parents, I just feel like a 10-year-old all over again. And I'm just like, I want to go back to the United States where I can speak English and feel in control and drive my own car.
Yeah. I always have to hold my breath whenever I head back home to the Philippines too, because it's just so pervasive and prevalent in the language, and and also really beautiful. So wanting to hold the complexity around that. But one, I think this encouragement that I also give to myself is that, know who you are, know where you stand, and while there is work to do in creating as less harm possible, especially around family, my invitation to myself is that, my invitation to myself is to find ways to like refuel in the context of, community who are already aligned with my values, and let my work and let my personhood speak for itself to my parents. And this is so funny because this is so personal too. Sometimes I also don't know what to do too.
I'm like, because here's my experience people like us who come from more of like a community organizing background, it's so
Right.
easy to speak in the context of what we're doing for the people
The
versus
family.
like where's the interpersonal piece,
Mm-hmm.
what's in it for us. And so just holding space for that so that people also know that we're in the work too, y'all. We're addressing our own stuff, our own family dynamics, our ancestral stuff. And it's only whatever you're comfortable sharing, but to also humanize the experience of
Mm-hmm.
people who are in these roles as healers.
Mm-hmm. Totally, totally. And that we need support too, that we
Yeah.
need nourishment too. Yeah.
Well, okay. If you could, if you could envision a future where we no longer have to, where we no longer have to talk about decolonization or dismantling or destroying any of these systems, what does that look like for you?
Mm, I love that question. I love questions like this. And it's also hard to imagine. And also really nice to imagine. Um,
Imagination is my favorite strategy, by the way.
mm, hmm Imagine, yeah, it's not just a freedom from, but a freedom for, right?
Mhm.
I want a world where there are more horizontal structures in supporting one another as opposed to top down. Instead, we count on each other for mutual aid, for even security, because I'm all about abolition. I'm all about dismantling the PIC. Um, and yeah, I can go on with that, but I'll restrain for now. Maybe another podcast episode. But and I just honestly, like, I just want to sing without having to sing about oppression. I just want to read without literature about whether that may be my people, whether that may be just stories or fiction or nonfiction stories, um, and just have Black, Indigenous, and people of color like celebrate ourselves as we are. And I know that that is informed by the struggle. And I also long for a time where we would just dance together and eat our food together and build our altars, have a big ass altar on an island, and just revere and manifest and love on the ancestors, the honorable ancestors. Um, I also envision a world where the stewardship of the land is returned to the indigenous peoples. The stewardship of Turtle Island is returned to them, where we have paid reparations. Um,
Can I make an invitation to you?
yeah.
What if you replaced I want with I am and speaking this future into the present
Mm-hmm.
moment?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how does that sound? Like
I'm just,
lost everything.
well, yeah, yeah. And I do this with my clients too. I do this with myself every single day because everything that you're saying, it's like, is that really something that's in the future, or is that something that we can embody in the here and the now? Tending
Mm,
to my altar, singing the songs of my spirit and my people.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd like to go off to an island and build a giant altar, but just to play. Like, if it,
Yeah.
what if we could speak our future as if it was already here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would. I would also say that I just feel like we're at a point of so much darkness too, and so
Yeah.
much death. And I do believe in that, and will say that it's just in this moment.
It's too dark.
Yeah. I can have my friends speak that on my behalf.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
in this moment, though, it feels a little distant.
Yeah. My last question is, seeing this future
Mhm.
version of an alternative world, or an alternative universe, that has been met. If you could speak to yourself as a
Mm.
future ancestor,
Mhm.
what words of wisdom
Mhm.
would they drop in this moment?
Eat that cake. Masturbate as much as you want. Keep at it. Keep going, and trust your path and lean into the mystery. Um, love yourself incredibly well. And it is okay to read that poem and take your time with it. It is okay to rest on that couch longer than you'd expected. Um, and may you keep stepping into your power, because that is going to allow other people to step into their power. And when you heal, others will also heal.
Yes, I like your future ancestor.
Yeah, she's fun.
Mm. Let's hear this poem.
This poem is called A Letter to My Descendants. To my descendants, my spiritual and maybe my biological ones, my every breath, word, and act is meant to say this louder: enough is enough. With my life, may I plant seeds by telling the truth to the ones who went before you and to the things that are now around you. And may these seeds bear fruit and flowers to give you a full life, where you no longer need to apologize for having your own voice, your own thought, your own preference and will. A life that does not require that much effort to breathe, to inhabit a space with a story to tell. I may never live long enough to know your name, your dreams, the repertoire of your creative, original work, sung and displayed, or kept secret, as they might be too sacred to be shared. Like a prayer you whisper whenever you get scared. And when you get scared, may you sing my song I hope was passed on, that tells you that you are formidable and strong, and loved and known by someone from a generation or so ago.
Wow. Gabes, you just like, you are a reincarnated ancestor in the flesh. I mean, we all
Mm,
are, but it's like you came remembering who the fuck you are,
mm.
and are here to wake us all up in also remembering that,
Mhm.
through the disguise of a therapist.
It is quite a disguise. Thank you, Juma K. I receive that.
Yeah,
I receive that.
yeah. I would just infiltrate this industry to drop some of my medicine. So Gabe, tell us more about where people can find more of
Mhm,
your work and your medicine,
mhm.
and yeah, if they wanted to continue this journey with you, where to go?
Yeah, yeah. People can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. The handle is Gabes Torres. The Facebook is facebook.com/Gabes Torres. You can also find me on GabesTorres.com, and there you'll be able to find all my offerings and services, where you'll also find information about the Ancestral, the Heritage Workshop on Ancestral Interconnectedness. And also, I have consultation hours that you can avail of if you are interested in having one-on-one sessions with me.
Yes, and if you wanted the poem
Yes.
that
Mm-hmm.
was just read, you can also find that on there as a gift for you, with the intention that you will also feel these words as your own, or maybe write your own
Yeah.
story and share that with your people and the next generation, because after all, we are all ancestors in the making. So thank you,
So
Gabes,
true.
for sharing space and
Thank you.
sharing your wisdom with us. And
Thank you.
yeah, I'm excited to call forth this future alongside you.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.